I'd like to call to order the policy committee meeting for Thursday, November 20th. At this point, we have Mr. Steele, Mr. Flynn from the Assembly in attendance. Ms. Heil is in for Ms. Edwards. Mr. Campbell and Mr. Sullivan are also present, so we have a quorum. Craig, can you run through our public involvement announcement that you do so well?
I'll try and remember it.
Thank you.
This is a public meeting. All AMATS meetings are public meetings, and the public is invited to comment. If we have a business item, we'll have a presentation by staff or a consultant. At that point, the committee will be given a chance to comment on the matter, and then the public will be invited to comment on each business item.
Thank you. In front of us, we have an agenda. Mr. Lyon, do we have any additions or corrections that you're aware of on the agenda?
No, sir.
Move to approve?
Second. Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Any objection to approval? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. We have in our packet the October 23rd, 2014 minutes.
Move to approve?
Move to approve.
I wasn't here.
Second. Moved and seconded.
Yeah.
Do we have any discussion on those minutes? Any corrections, amendments? Any objection to those being adopted? Minutes are approved. Business items. We have the 2014 operating agreement memo revisions and addendum. Mr. Lyon, is that you?
Yes, this is me. So this item came before you last month. You see the discussion reflected in the minutes that you just approved. And my understanding, since I wasn't at the meeting, there was a discussion at the policy committee to ask for some clarification and or a recommendation from the AMATS Technical Advisory Committee. And so this is back before you today because the AMATS Technical Advisory Committee voted to approve this, recommend approval for this on you. And just to remind folks what we're doing here, we have two major changes to the operating agreement. The first one is the changing of the name. Currently, we are the Anchorage Metropolitan Area Transportation Solutions, and the recommendation is to change the S to system, so it'll better kind of reflect that we are working on a full kind of system, a transportation system. Doesn't mean we're not necessarily looking for solutions, but this kind of reflects the idea that we're all integrated here. So that would be the first change there. And the second change relates to the Citizens Advisory Committee. As you know, we have utilized the Planning and Zoning Commission as our Citizens Advisory Committee for many, many years. Previous to that, there was a separate Citizens Advisory Committee that was appointed by AMATS and met just for AMATS issues. There are several reasons why we are suggesting that, which I can go into detail on. Probably the most important one is the fact that at our last certification, the Federal Highways Administration and the Federal Transit Administration strongly suggested that we should evaluate the makeup of our Planning and Zoning Commission to determine if it represents the diverse makeup of Anchorage citizens and transportation stakeholders. And as you know, the Planning and Zoning Commission is not an AMATS committee. It is a municipal board, the members of which are appointed by the mayor and approved by the local assembly. So our ability to change the makeup of that is limited at best. So the suggestion is to create a Citizens Advisory Committee that is appointed by the AMATS Policy Committee and meets for any of our items and is created to kind of really reflect the diverse makeup of Anchorage and Eagle River, of course, and serve at the Policy Committee's pleasure and work for that. So those two changes were recommended to have the approval at the Technical Advisory Committee.
Okay. So the action before us is release this for public comment? Or is to adopt this?
This is to adopt it. It's been out and posted for 2 months now, but
Everything I was looking at myself. So did we release this for a 30-day? I'm just looking at the bottom of page 5A here where it says that we recommend release, blah, 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 for 30-day public review.
That was last month, October 23. Top one.
I see. So just a month behind the times, I guess. So we have released it. Have we released it for a 30-day public review comment?
You know, to tell you the truth, Mr. Chair, in the ensuing amount of time since we played around with it last, I honestly don't remember. I don't remember I know James wasn't at the last meeting either because we were both at the AMPO conference, so,
Can I comment? At the last meeting, and it reflects in the minutes, that Mr. Fakala's had a lot of concerns because that we didn't have the details, so the bylaws hadn't been identified. And it doesn't look like the bylaws have been addressed, because there was concern about, in this memo, that you'd had a 9 committee member of at-large members, when I don't think 9 at-large is what we really want for that committee. So I'm not sure if it's quite ready to be released if you don't have the bylaws figured out and all the questions that Mr. Michaelis had identified and been answered yet.
So I guess, let me take one step back, thank you, Cindy. What has the TAC recommended on this, for this action here? I mean, what I'm seeing before me in writing is that they recommend a 30-day public comment period. So you're telling me they've reviewed this and they approved this and they're recommending adoption of it?
Ms. Heil's probably correct. Again, I wasn't at your last meeting, so, but I believe that.
Well, I'm
they
talking
do-
about the TAC meeting.
Right, and they said, I believe that they recommended the release. I will tell you, as an aside, I did have a briefing with Mr. Michaelis on Tuesday, and he was very comfortable now with the makeup of that and has, as I described it. The operating agreement, by and large, I mean, those are not bylaws for those separate committees. We have a set of bylaws for each of our advisory committees where the specific makeup and backgrounds of each member are listed. So it would not be something we normally put into our operating agreement.
Oh, I know.
But we did have a straw man of our bylaws and took that before the Technical Advisory Committee. I believe that at one of your meetings, we did pass out that straw man there. The idea, or my thought was, this is an opportunity to approve the idea of the creation of a separate Citizen Advisory Committee, and then we will come back and work on those bylaws and fine tune them to where we want them later.
Okay. Thank you. Let me ask if there's any, is there any public comment, testimony? Anybody that can clarify the situation for us? No? Okay. Committee members, questions, comments? Mr. Steele?
I'd be more comfortable if we knew what we were shooting for in terms of makeup, or experience, or background, or rather than
So
just.
you'd like to see a more detailed committee description?
Yeah, I
before we
don't want
adopt
to nail it
policy?
down that this one is the bicycle, this one is the,
Okay.
what type of interest, what type of mix do we want on that particular committee?
I don't think this precludes that, but I
It doesn't.
understand your concern. Mr.
Yeah.
Flynn?
Well, I'm intrigued by the possibility, because we have a pretty prescribed process when we put things out for public review, and of course, the planning and zoning has a relatively limited meeting schedule. So,
Politely put.
Plus, they usually-
To be a politician. I just said it takes a dang long time.
I guess I would be interested in knowing if we form this group, what their meeting schedule would look like, whether it would be kind of on an as-needed basis when we had something we needed them to review, and they therefore schedule a meeting a week after we put something out for public review, or is it the first Thursday of every month? Or and maybe that's something that goes into their bylaws, but
I think it absolutely would be.
yeah.
So conceptually, you're okay with this, but you're interested in the bylaws as well.
Well, I want to make sure that this group has a little more flexibility than planning and zoning
A
does.
little more responsiveness.
You're putting words in my mouth, Mr. Chairman. But, yeah, so I'd just like to make sure that if I think conceptually it's okay, but I do want to see some flexibility.
Mr. Salt?
Yeah, a couple of things. Well, since we don't know whether it's gone out for the 30-day notice, I don't think we can take any action today until we clarify that. And it hasn't been 30 days yet anyway, so we need to clear that up. Probably postpone this, I think, until next meeting, till then we know for sure that there's been 30 days. And in the meantime, we can definitely renotice if we need to, or get information back to us that the notice was out there to the public. And another thing is this a required committee? I mean, it's been the Planning and Zoning Committee, but is this within the AMATS rules, something that's absolutely required, or?
It's a good question. I don't know. Like, Mr. Lyon?
There's no requirement to have a Citizens Advisory Committee. I did research and looked at probably about 50 MPOs around the country, and I'd say less than 5 of them had citizens advisory committees or some
Okay.
form of that other.
I guess my-
And so it's something that we've had at AMATS for a very long time, although for the majority of it, it's been planning and zoning. And we moved to planning and zoning because at the time we were having challenges getting a quorum because we had specific assigned seats and it was hard to get those seats filled. So we, AMATS, before my time, before most of our time, created the idea that we would piggyback onto planning and zoning because they meet regularly.
Sure.
so on and so
No, I get all
forth.
that.
And so it is not required.
There you go.
Most of the ones around the country are, there are so many different government jurisdictions in those entities, so they pick 1 or 2 members from each entity. In this case, we only have 1 local government. That's partly why we suggested in the straw man to have at-large members.
Yeah, I guess the reason I asked is that it clearly is the exception rather than the rule to have these kind of committees, and I guess my concern would be adding an extra layer of time, and the technical advisory committee, I mean, I think we try and do our best to make sure it's a diverse group of interested parties, and I'm not sure I want to add an extra layer of bureaucracy to the bureaucracy.
I think it's replacing an already existing layer.
No, I know it is, but the question then becomes, is that layer even necessary at all?
Yeah.
If most MPOs don't even have such a thing.
My 2 cents is that it came up at the last certification, the idea of, you have a citizens advisory committee, we're worried that it's representative. If we decided to solve that suggestion in the certification by saying, well, it's not required, so we're not going to have one anymore, I'd be concerned about the giant spotlight shown on us then. And if we change, if we morph our citizens advisory committee into one that we have a little more control over the makeup of it, I think USDOT would look at that favorably as opposed to saying it's not required, let's take it out altogether.
Well,
But
it's our job to worry about the politics, Craig.
you're absolutely right. I'm just giving you my 2 cents.
Okay, so I think at very least, we've got something we need to remand back to TAC here and have them discuss. I think the mayor's suggestion is a valid one, and I'm not sure I support it 100%, but I think it's a question worth asking is, do we need a citizens advisory committee? We've got a lot of advice that we get through different groups and the technical advisory committee as well. I'm not saying yay or nay, but can you take this back, subject to approval by the board here, and have the technical advisory committee look at this and look at that question as well, not just do we need a 30-day notice and get the 30-day notice out, but do we need, my question is, do we even need a 30-day notice on this stuff? I'm not even sure we need that to change this stuff,
We're just doing 30 days. It's been our normal public comment period.
Right. And I think secondarily, I'd like to have them look at whether we need a citizens advisory committee and whether the TAC recommends or does not recommend having a citizens advisory committee. Does that satisfy the members of the board for the purpose of this meeting?
I just want to make sure I clearly understand this. Somebody serves in the CAC role. It's either this committee or planning and zoning or some other committee.
It's not required, though.
Or no one.
Can we literally not have one? I don't know, no other,
There are other MPOs that do not have them.
is that common?
You just said the majority don't.
You said the majority of them are CAC.
Of the ones that I looked at, and again, it was probably about 45 or so, majority of them did not have a separate, called out citizen advisory committee. They may have, and I know some of those do, they put together a citizen advisory committee for a certain project. Like they would have that for a MTP update or a Eagle River CBD study update. And we do that same sort of thing. We oftentimes will have a separate group that gets together for that purpose. The idea behind this is that it would meet, the citizen advisory group would meet quarterly or as needed. That's how our freight committee works, our BPAC works,
I guess
the same sort of thing.
I guess, I'd like to see a copy of the section of our most recent audit that made this recommendation.
The language is in your,
Is that specifically called out?
in the middle of the
Distinction.
memo there.
Yeah, the
Where it says there's typically a distinction.
incorporation.
That was the language in the certification review.
I guess, I just see the context.
Okay.
Very good. what it tells me is a CAC is better than a planning and zoning committee. What it doesn't tell me is whether it's better off just not having it at all, or what the reaction would be if we did that.
What it says is it's good to get public comment. I mean,
And diversity of the makeup of the citizen, of the members.
and you might get a more diverse from a committee specific for this purpose as opposed to the plan.
Okay, well, I have obviously failed in trying to prevent this attack, so I look for a motion from the board then for some formal action.
Yeah, move to postpone this item until the next meeting contingent upon, A, the 30-day notice requirement, and B, Mr. Lyons providing us more information on just how these committees potentially work in other jurisdictions, and maybe some statistical information on, as you said, if the majority don't have them, let's quantify that a little bit. It's a complex motion.
I'm sure it's well taken down. Second on that motion?
So you want to postpone it?
Sure.
Second, Mr. Steele?
Um,
Discussion, Ms. Heil.
Yes, please. I know that that's, the question now is whether we have one or not, but if the decision is to have one, you're still going to delay us because you haven't figured out the details of the bylaws. So my suggestion was to kind of modify that a bit and add let's have a pros and cons of all the, whether we should have one or not have one, and all the legal ramifications, and the potential what a bylaws of the committee would look like, so you have the entire picture to make a decision on. So,
So I'll take that as a friendly amendment.
okay, thank you.
So now we have a motion before us to look at those two things and in conjunction to put forward a draft committee bylaw if it's determined the committee is what we need. I believe that is the motion as it stands.
Fair enough.
Any further discussion?
Comment, ask them.
I think I asked him at the start of this, didn't I?
Okay.
I don't dare go back there again. Something could happen. Okay, any further discussion from the committee? Any objection to that motion as revised, friendly, Lee, by Ms. Heil? Okay, that motion passes.
And then one question, Mr. Chairman. If by the next meeting, we get the data that we want, as well as a proposed set of bylaws, do those bylaws then need to go out for a 30-day public? Because we're asking the public to comment on the concept, but the bylaws are actually the devil in the details. Would that go back out, in your opinion, or Craig's opinion?
Our history is that I don't believe we've ever taken those committee bylaws public. We've done them internally, as far as I know.
Okay.
We've modified the bike and ped bylaws internally and
We
several
have,
times.
we have, the last ones that we brought out were the bike and ped ones and the freight ones, and we did take those out for 30-day public
You did?
review. Yes, we did.
Okay.
So those, I mean, they're drafted, we've dropped them off for you, and the TAC has looked at them as well as a straw man. They were not up as a business item, they were just, here's informational as a swing at it, see what you think, sort of thing.
Yeah, we need, there's a discussion needs to happen.
All right. So if, Mr. Lyon, then if we need to public notice those, can you please post them when you reach whatever conclusions you do with the TAC? And then I believe what this body can do is take action pending the completion of the 30 days and if there's comments are not received. Okay, we waded through that one. Now we're on to the 2040 MTP update.
And this is an item that is before you, basically just because when we have the MTP as a update, as we're working through that process, we have this as a business item in case there's any business to be before you. We don't actually have this business for you, but this is the one that starts off, it says 2040 MTP critical path schedule. So it's just to kind of show you down below the tasks that we have and how they're intertwined with the household travel survey, the travel demand model update, et cetera, and how they all kind of connect together. And it talks about how in the second quarter we had a certain schedule, showing our slight delay in the schedule. At the TAC last week, the TAC agreed to confirm the idea of doing an interim MTP at the same time as we were doing our regular MTP so that we could reset the clock and not worry about going into a conformity lapse while we're still going full speed ahead with our full MTP update. So this is just kind of informational to let you know what kind of, how the schedules line up and where we have some slippage and our suggested path out of that. TAC did confirm the idea of doing an interim MTP. That's how we talked about it at the TAC last week.
And so is that an action item before us at some point in time, or is that the interim MTP?
The interim MTP would be before you at some time for approval, yes.
Are we gonna have a choice?
In deciding whether or not to do an interim MTP or not, you're the policy committee, you have the final say on everything.
Well, I guess I
No.
was, if you wait until T-minus 20 seconds and say we can't get there from here, we really don't have any choice then, do we?
Well, the idea is, our regular path for creating a new MTP, if you look at the schedule, you can see that we are not going to make the required date of, I believe it's May 25th, 2016. We're not going to be able to get there in time. And so the interim MTP allows us to start a 4-year clock, restart the clock, I should say, so that we don't have to worry about going into a conformity lapse. If we don't do an interim MTP, I don't see any way to get the regular full MTP approved in time.
So you're telling me the decision's already been made? We really already have no choice?
No, that's correct. If you want to not go into
Well, must
conformity
be
lapse.
approved.
Yeah. Okay. If we don't want to go into conformity lapse, then no.
All right. Any other questions comments from the public on this item? Even though there's the formal action here. Committee members, Mr. Steele, any comments or questions?
If you can do an interim, why can't you do the whole thing, except that, go ahead and do the interim, get the extra time just in case.
Well, the thing is, I think we have to be really careful about managing public expectations on this, because the reason we're doing a full MTP update is we promised we would do, on the last update, that we would do a full MTP update, the model, a robust update, and it's the model with the travel demand, the household survey is taking longer. So that needs to go on a path to have a robust model and all the really good defensible information that we need to do a full plan. The idea of an interim update was when we discussed this at a work session at the end of August, early September, was to rapidly try to do an interim update, spend as little of resources as possible on it, get it out of the way, and so that attention could be focused. The concerns I have on here is by saying, oh yeah, we're gonna do it all together in the same thing, puts it on a really long, drawn-out schedule and makes the interim possibly more expensive than it really needs to be. And I am concerned about that. I know that staff hasn't taken the contract that was supposed to for the MTP and rolled the interim into that contract. So they're both on delays on how long it's going to take to get that contract up, instead of trying to possibly do the interim update in-house with maybe some help from DOT, which I'm volunteering on.
Thank you.
But there's some nuances in here, and it's not just something that you could easily just say, oh yeah, this is fine and dandy. I think the interim could be done faster,
So
so
do we have an actual action item here to take?
I don't think so.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add one piece of information. I know Cindy wasn't at the
No, I
TAC
wasn't.
meeting. The discussion at the TAC meeting was to add the idea of an interim update to the MTP as an additive alternate, such that when the contract went out, if we decide that's still the right way to go, we would add it into the consultant contract. If we're seeing it slow down, we could devote staff time, both MOA and DOT staff, to doing that interim update, and we wouldn't add it into the contract. But that was kind of the way around it, I think, to get to Cindy's concern of if it gets caught in a long, drawn-out process to get to a consultant, you could pull it to the side and do it in-house.
Okay, so it sounds like what we need again is we need the TAC to come back to us next month and tell us what the plan is, lay out. I'm sure Ms. Heil will be attending this TAC meeting and express herself quite clearly as to what her concerns are. And those concerns can be brought forward, and if there's some decision we have to make. But I share the concern that we don't want to be doing the interim to the same level of detail we're doing the final one. And I'm also concerned, not to shoot at the mayor here, but the city procurement process is sometimes a little more delayed than other processes, and I don't want to get hung up in a procurement issue. So can you bring forward the tax recommendations for how we move these things forward? Both the MTP and the interim.
I guess, I mean, I thought that's what, the TAC.
I don't see an action item here in front of us. What I see is an update item. And what I'm hearing from Cindy is that she doesn't believe that right now we've got a sufficient, I don't have a TAC recommendation in front of me to do something, do I?
The TAC recommended at their meeting to go forward with the interim idea rolled into that as an additive alternate.
In the contract?
Yes, as an additive alternate at the meeting last month, at
But I-
the meeting last week.
Is that an action item for us
It was
today?
not an action item for you.
Okay.
It was the idea in terms of the amount of time left, we need to get rolling on it.
But isn't the action item that we're approving the schedule?
This wasn't here for you as approval, it's here for you to, for information to show you, here's the schedule, here's where we've slipped, and just keeping you apprised of where we are on the schedule.
Mr. Steele?
Where's the savings? What does the actual have of the interim doesn't? Is it the time frame? I mean, in terms of, it's only gonna go out for another year or 2 years or something, rather than going out.
We're running into a time crunch because our conformity will lapse.
But what does the interim plan not have, that the final plan is gonna have to have?
The interim.
Such that one would take longer than the other?
The interim MTP looks at the current MTP and says, make sure you have any projects that have been done since we just adopted it, mark those off the list, double check the goals that are in there and make sure they're still current, and just use
So it's just-
the current model.
It's just a brush over, it's not.
Right,
for a
it's to restart the
limited period
clock,
of time.
whereas
Full
It's an
stop.
extension of the existing.
It's
Yeah.
mostly fiscal constraint.
And you should be
Check
able
your
to do
air
it faster.
quality,
Yeah.
do a
Right.
few little checks, it's done. It should
Yeah,
be
whereas-
quick, dirty, and get out.
The full-blown MTP is
I'd like
using the
volunteers to
household
do it.
travel survey to update our model. We're doing this large process to update this new model, then taking that new model and with new assumptions and go forward and create a new MTP.
So,
Pretty
Mr. Chairman,
different. Mr.
so,
Sullivan?
Ms. Hiles, your objection and use the timeline you think is too long and that it'll lead to too much delay because you think it should be a shorter, narrower scope of work and, I mean, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's legitimate.
I think there's concern that the two things are being kind of lumped together, and that the lump might move pretty slowly, and that there's some,
Right. And,
keeping them separate might move them faster.
yes,
Whether it's through procurement or through contract or whatever, having them together might not be the most efficient way to move the interim forward.
And I think that was the idea behind the additive alternate, is kind of think about if things work and the process starts going faster through procurement and we can move along and add it together, we would get the benefit of having a consultant who can help us with that. If it starts to slow down, we can have staff take care of it, and it's an additive alternate, it's not in the RFP to begin with.
I mean, I wasn't.
Would you like to make a motion? I mean, we can have this discussion all day, but let's either make a motion or let's get on with it.
I'm not quite sure what to ask, what to have. What I would think is, since I was at the meeting last week and Jennifer was, maybe we'd have, she could also, it sounds like the additive alternative was a compromise to frustrations that we've had at the PAC before. And what I'm wondering is, at what point do we have to wait to see if the contracting process is working versus getting started on the interim right now and getting it done? I guess that's what it comes down to.
Okay. Anybody from the public have any comments on this?
I would like to say, Jennifer Witt, through the chair to the committee, that the reason that the AMATS Technical Committee recommended an interim to begin with is because our existing MTP already goes through 2035, 20 years from 2015, so that if we could buy ourselves 2 years with the intent of having additional time to work through the model update and the household travel survey and to do a more thorough job instead of being rushed. I mean, that provides a little bit of background. There was some discussion by the TAC, and Lance Wilbur did recommend, I don't think it was voted on, I think it was just an acknowledgement that in theory, we need to have the ability to carve that off very, very quickly if indeed the whole process gets bogged down. And this was after discussion where it had been acknowledged that there's been some challenges getting things through procurement within the municipality. So that's where
Okay.
I move that we ask the TAC for a formal recommendation on how to handle the interim update of the MTP.
Moved and seconded.
What time?
Okay. We've got a motion in front of us. Comments? Mr. Steele? Mr. Flynn?
Let's get on with it.
Mr. Sullivan? Sal, any further comments?
No. Good.
Any objection to the motion in front of us? Seeing none? Formal recommendation, please. Next item, which could even be more entertaining than the last two. I know it seems hard to believe, but we're building to a crescendo. The travel demand modeling assumptions.
So you have item 5C, the.
I did, oh, I'm sorry, AMATS. Oh, I'm so excited.
This one will be fun, though.
Yeah. BPAC appointment. How could I skip that?
I hesitate to start talking about, but this is filling a public member seat, or 4 public member seats on the Bike and Ped Committee. And Todd Logan had the seat previously, and he moved to Florida. And so this is Daryl Hess, who many of you should know. He's actually a municipal ombudsman right now, and he has a strong interest in walking and other sorts of non-motorized transportation. And so the TAC met and recommended approval of Mr. Hess at the last meeting. He did go to our AMATS Bike and Ped meeting on Monday night, so he did get immersed in the procedures, and he did note that there seemed to be a lot of bicycle interest on the committee, and he was happy to provide a more pedestrian kind of idea there. So,
Thank you. Anyone from the crowd, public, have any comments about Mr. Hess's nomination? Committee members, Mr. Sullivan?
Move to approve. Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Any objection to unanimous approval? No objection. Mr. Hess is approved on the Bike and Ped Committee. Now we get to travel demand modeling assumptions. 5D, is that you again, Mr. Lyon?
I think I'm going to start it. We should have our consultant, Jeff Fricanja, on the phone, and we'll have a PowerPoint presentation. So the Technical Advisory Committee met last week. We had our first meeting 2 weeks ago, and then it was continued to last week, with extensive discussion on this topic.
So, and can I just assume that we're going to be asked to endorse these assumptions at the end of this presentation? Is that what
There
we're
is
going to
a
do?
formal recommendation requested, so
To
we
adopt these recommendations?
Well, there's 2 different recommendations.
Yes, I was going to say, there's 2 different recommendations.
we are going to ask for a formal recommendation out of the committee of
Okay.
something,
Okay.
whatever it is they want to do.
I actually did some research on this one, Mr. Chairman.
I'll look for you to provide valuable insight.
Yeah, I'm ready to start. Thank you. My name is Teresa Brewer. I'm a senior transportation planner with AMATS, and we're here today to make a presentation on the travel demand model update. Just as a brief background to let you know what the travel demand model does. It basically helps us figure out the future transportation infrastructure, and it looks at generating demand. And those are based on some basic assumptions about land use, socioeconomic, employment, population, number of households, and then it also includes information about what do your roads look like, what are the lane, the capacity, the speeds, the volumes, and that looks at parking costs, transit fares, and that type of thing. And the reason that the travel demand model update is integral to our process is, as you know, we have a household travel survey going on, we have the model update, is all the inputs, such as I just mentioned, feed into our MTP update. So clearly, we're wanting to move forward with some recommendations and approval of socioeconomic projections for the travel demand model update. Just an overview of our agenda. Jeff Fricanja will give some information about the socioeconomic projections. We also have Peter here from McDowell Group that can answer questions about the different type of socioeconomic projections that we looked at, including ICER and the Department of Labor, the TAC's recommendation, the staff recommendation, and then some supporting information on why staff chose to go with Department of Labor, and then some discussion and questions at the end. Jeff will discuss this slide and a couple more slides, but just to introduce Jeff Fricanja, he's the project manager for the travel demand model update. He's with RSG Incorporated. He also served as a modeling specialist for FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, and model specialist for the Puget Sound Regional Council, MPO in the Seattle area. So I'll hand it over to Jeff. Jeff?
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks to the committee members for hearing us today. I'm now on slide 4, which is entitled SE Regional Projections or Socioeconomic Regional Projections. And the point of this particular discussion is just to be clear on what you're being asked to approve today. This specific data product that you're being asked to pronounce on includes the population and employment and household statistics that would become key inputs to the travel demand model in its base year, which is 2013, 2028, and 2040 future years. 2040, of course, being the new planning horizon for your what will be your updated MTP. And so these are totals of population and employment by area, and for very good reasons having to do with the fact that different parts of the modeled region are somewhat different demographically. The staff and consultant team agreed that the model should include 3 broad sub-areas: the Anchorage Bowl, of course, and Shugiak-Eagle River, which are your formal federal planning area, but also the Matsu Valley portion of the overall Matsu borough, because a significant number of people from Matsu commute to work in Anchorage. And so the model will serve you better, we suggest, if it internalizes the Matsu borough as it does its analysis. So the important takeaway about the sub-areas to the action you're being asked to take is that the McDowell Group, who is our land use projection expert, and us have decided that the regional projections that you're approving actually need to be broken out by these 3 sub-areas so that we are more precisely representing the distribution of jobs and people for the travel model. Now, having said that, the sub-area level and, of course, total modeled region numbers that you're being asked to look at today will later be allocated to smaller geographies called traffic analysis zones, or TAZs. It's the TAZ level allocation that actually is the direct input to the model. So you're being asked to approve the overall regional scale projections and the sub-area breakouts. The technical work of allocating to TAZs will happen later. So, and of course, as Teresa has already mentioned, there's a long history of consultation that she and other staff undertook with peer agencies in your area, and some of that, actually much of that is detailed in the memo you were given, but we have brief overviews of it later in the supporting information portion of this presentation. So I'm going to move on now and talk about the TAC recommendation because it needs some explaining. The slide I'm on now is slide 5, which is entitled TAC recommendation. So the 2 tables that you see on the screen summarize the original Department of Labor-based future year projection in year 2040 that the consultant team presented to staff and that staff recommended to the TAC. This is in the column entitled Draft AMATS 2040 Population, and in the column immediately below that, Draft AMATS 2040 Employment. And just for convenience sake, we have combined together the Anchorage Bull and Shugiak-Eagle River subareas into the first row of each table, with the Matsu Valley projections in the second row of each table, with regional totals in the third. So the first column of numbers, Draft AMATS 2040, is the original analysis and recommendation from the consultant team and the staff to the TAC. At the TAC meeting, the TAC recommended to you that you direct staff to splice a separate estimate that the Matsu Borough has done for its own long-range transportation plan update into the Matsu Valley sub-area projections that AMATS would use for its travel model and its planning purposes. And so what we've done here, and there's more detail in the memo, but what we've done here for discussion's sake is to show an approximate figure for what that would result in what you would be approving. The reason it's approximate is that it will take a little bit of adjustment for us to scale the Matsu numbers, which are in year 2035 to 2040, and we want to take care to do that carefully if you direct us to do that. And so these numbers are approximate. The last column on the right shows the percent difference between the approximate TAC recommended projections and the original consultant and staff recommended projections, which, as you can see, for population, and as we will mention later, population was the particular item that greatly concerned the TAC members. The so-called spliced recommendation would essentially have 16% more population in the Matsu Valley in year 2040 than the original analysis, with a 5% overall regional total. By region, I refer to the planning area within the modeled space, which is essentially 5% different from the Department of Labor forecasts in that year. The employment figures in the lower table, as you can see, are actually much closer to each other in the Matsu Valley sub-area. The TAC recommendation to do this splice operation would actually lower the Matsu Valley sub-area population in the AMATS estimates in year 2040 by about 10%, which would correspond to a 2% reduction in the overall regional employment total in year 2040. So that's really the crux of the two different recommendations before you, is the original DOL-based series of numbers in the left column and the TAC recommended sort of spliced version of them in the right column. So with that, I want to pass it off to Teresa Brewer again so she can discuss the staff recommendation and some of the supporting information, but I'm certainly available for questions and will stay on the line. Thank you.
Thank you.
The AMAT staff recommendations is on this following slide, and we worked with McDowell Group and Department of Labor and Workforce Development, Eddie Hunsinger, to develop these projections. And the Department of Labor uses a cohort methodology that's driven by age, birth, in and out migration. And the reason we didn't use ICER data was ICER data is from 2009, and unfortunately, ICER, there's uncertainty about when we can get that report. They originally thought they would have it available in November, but due to staffing and other constraints, they are not able to produce that report on a consistent basis. And knowing that we have an MTP update, and then also we are required by the federal government to use the latest planning assumptions according to 23 CFR 453.22E, we chose that this may prove to be a better methodology. And by the time that we do our metropolitan plan update, ICER data would be over 6 years old. So that's why we chose this path. We did consult with the Matsu Borough early on. DOT staff and myself went to discuss with Dr. Goldsmith on the availability and cost to get the study done if they were to produce it. and they quoted us at a cost of over $150,000. So at that point, it just didn't seem like a really viable alternative. So this is why we explored these projections.
So Teresa, just to go back, so when you say you consulted with Matsu, did you take these numbers to Matsu and say, this is what our consultants came up for your area, and do you agree with these? Because what it looks like to me is that your consultants have come up with some projections for another area outside our MPO. But we don't know, but have they bought off on it?
They have
agreed?
a copy of the technical memorandum, but I have not received any comments from them. And they've been invited to several of the meetings
Right, but that
also.
doesn't mean that they've agreed with that, right?
No.
Are you finished or?
Okay, I'm just asking questions. I'm not Jason.
I know you are.
And if there's any questions about the methodology and how McDowell Group approached this, Peter is here and is happy to answer any questions.
So do you have more slides?
I do, if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Okay.
We kind of took a little detour.
And this kind of brings us to what Cindy was talking about, some of the supporting information on regional collaboration. We initially started talking with the Matsu Borough in December of 2013, actually, because we recognized that there was a desire to begin collaborating on a regional growth allocation for the area. And in those initial discussions, we'd hoped that that would be something that we could jointly fund together, and the Matsu Borough seemed very interested in that at that time. We also had a teleconference with Department of Labor staff, Eddie Hunsinger, with the Matsu Borough, and then later met with Central Region staff to discuss the potentiality of jointly funding these types of projects, including the household travel survey. Unfortunately, at that time, it was determined that the LRTP, long-range transportation plan that the Matsu Borough was working on, that it did not fit into their time schedule. So that's why we never had regional collaboration on the growth allocations. And we would hope for that. And as part of the RFP that I wrote for this project, we included a task to begin the discussion of regional collaboration. So that will continue to occur in the future. And I do appreciate everybody's hard work on this. And in your memo, it discussed a lot more in detail. And of course, as we just highlighted, the Department of Labor provides a regional-wide forecast. The Department of Labor forecasts are more recent than the ICER. We are required by federal highways to use the latest available estimates. And also, APA Code of Ethics states that we, as planners, must present the latest available information to you as decision and policymakers in how you answer to the general public. We don't know when future ICER forecasts will be available. It's uncertain. We would recommend that we develop a policy to use Department of Labor forecast in the future. The Fairbanks Metropolitan Planning Agency has already adopted Department of Labor forecasts at this time for their travel demand model. So it's just something to keep in mind. And then also during our TAC discussion, there was concern over the 25,000 population difference in the future horizon. As Jeff Rakonja mentioned during that discussion, what happens in 2040, we're not really sure. We're probably all wrong. We also don't know what people's travel behavior or patterns will be. A lot of people are wanting to not own cars and move closer into cities. So it would vary. Those are uncertainties, but maybe if we can plan within a band of uncertainties, that will make life easier for all of us. And I think, Jeff, you were going to discuss the splice here on this slide.
Sure.
Thank you.
I just want to make the policy committee aware of an option that AMATS staff and the consultant team had discussed, which a member of the public brought up at the TAC meeting as well, which is that the option exists as well, not to pick one set of numbers or the other, but to, for example, direct staff to use the original DOL-based numbers, but also to during what we call model validation, when we test lots of different inputs to the model to be sure that the model is responding plausibly and reasonably across a range of inputs, we could very well test the splice numbers as a part of that and actually bring you folks and other stakeholders those results, so that on the one hand you have the original DOL-based forecast that essentially meets the various regulatory requirements and mitigates other risks that Reese already discussed, but also have an actual understanding of what the model would be telling you across a range of potential future land use, population, and employment distributions. So I think that would be useful. Speaking as a modeler, it is often done elsewhere, and so I just wanted to be sure that that is on the table here. Thank you, Teresa.
And then we just wanted to stop and ask if there was any questions. Clearly, we are asking for approval for the recommendation of the scenario analysis and sensitivity test, using the DOL data as our baseline, and then doing the sensitivity analysis to consider the potential impacts to the network and the system.
I think there'll be quite a few questions. Let me strike while the iron's hot and see if there's anybody in the crowd that would like to make a comment at this point. It's not really in your right to interrogate people, but you can certainly make a 2-minute speech or plea if you so wish to at this time. Mr. Katzian.
Gary Katzian. And I attended also the TAC briefing on continuation meeting.
You stand up so you can project a little better. Thank you.
Okay. It made a lot of sense in the discussion to talk about the changeover from the ICER-based modeling. If it's uncertain that as you go forward, that's not going to be available, it seemed like now would be a good time to make that change to a base that would be consistent data that you carry on throughout. And then also then the coordination with the Matsu and Kinnick Arm Crossing project is a must. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else with a comment? Okay, Mr. Flynn. Take me silent. I know you are primed, sir.
A couple of questions, and Ms. Heil, I appreciate your inquiring about the
Oh, we got plenty.
when the ICER data would be ready and so on and so forth. That was helpful. Do we have a similar Department of Labor numbers from 2009? And if so, do we know how they correlate with the ICER numbers?
I believe that they did some earlier works to check the trends, and I'll ask Jeff and Peter to verify this. But from my understanding, they tracked very well with earlier numbers. Peter, do you have anything that you could add to that or verify what I'm actually saying?
To clarify, you're asking how did they compare with the ICER numbers?
Yeah, I mean, did the DOL, I presume DOL does this every year or every so many years?
They do it once every 2 years, which
Yeah.
So-
gives us some certainty when this data will be available
Okay, so
versus ICER.
did their 2009 exercise come up with similar numbers to what ICER came up with?
Not by the time you got to 2040, but they
When they did their numbers in 2009?
sorry, yes. when
Were they
in 2009,
roughly consistent with ICER?
Right. They track very closely to begin with, and then they begin to diverge.
And then what were the differences and assumptions for the Department of Labor in 2013 versus 2009 that may have contributed to that divergence?
You're taxing my memory, but I would say the big one was when the Kabata Bridge would be completed. That was a major assumption, which in 2009, the expectation was that it would be completed much more expediently than it currently is. The price of oil, I know, is another one that's, in the ICER projections, definitely the price of oil is higher than it currently is at. The assumptions behind the DOL projections largely are based on migration. For the most part, they don't make very many assumptions. They look at trends. But they did have to make some assumption about migration into the Matsu Valley versus into Anchorage. And I believe that was one where if they just looked at the trends, the current trend rate of migration would have just been off the charts. And so at some point they have to impose a limit to it. Those are the main ones that I recall at the moment.
Right, and I spoke with Dr.
Jeff,
Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
just wanted to add that another assumption was the timeline of the pipeline.
Right, yes. Yeah.
So the original 2009 ICER forecast had a much sooner timeline on that, as I understand it.
And I spoke with Dr. Goldsmith recently, and he stated that the planning assumptions that ICER used in 2009 have definitely changed. For instance, Kinnick Bridge is not open, LNG, et cetera. And he said the analysis and results would change, but obviously he hasn't had time to conduct that analysis. So what that would mean, he can't confirm or deny.
Okay. I'll cede the floor for a little while here, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Sullivan, do you have anything to know? Ms. Heil?
So let me, since I missed the two TEC meetings and from looking at this at a higher level, we have technical issues, we have a technical disagreement between the TAC and staff, correct? Is that what I get here, is a technical different issues, all right? We have a model that we're building, right? That we're trying to give the latest and greatest information. Matsu has a model that they've validated and working. We have different years that don't match up. And so it seems to me, and I worry about this because this is going to happen every 4 years if we don't get this right. The other thing is that we have to be defensible. If we have a controversial project, bridge, Glen Highway decisions, and we don't have good solid numbers, we're going to be in here again like we did the last with the MTP, looking at TMZ zones or whatever they're called, and where these numbers are, Taz, and it's a pain in the ass, and I really don't recommend that. So, first of all, we recommended a while ago this policy procedure number 6. It says let's standardize the socioeconomic data because we didn't want to get into that conundrum that we're facing right now. And the underlying route was to work with Matsu. So we're consistent. And I know from your presentation, they're not there yet or we're not working. So from my perspective, what we have is something that if we're not really careful, we're going to set ourselves up for having problems in the future when we have controversial issues. Because if Matsu doesn't agree with what we put into their area, they could sue us like they did with the bridge. They could put detractors to say, yep, we don't agree with these numbers, and they're going to say there's no numbers, and it's just going to be a morass of a mess. And so I just want to put these qualifiers on here because this is not easy decisions. And actually, in my mind, it would go back to the TAC. I would even recommend is saying, okay, either use the model outputs from Matsu for our inputs, or I would get an independent third party like Jeff Hoke out of FHWA in Denver to say, here's all the issues. How do we update our models with the latest planning assumptions? Is it just the MPO, this is their regs, or are we supposed to go out the whole entire region, beyond our boundaries? That seems a little bit stretching, but these aren't our regs. Let's get their assumptions or their interpretation and maybe help try to come up with how to handle a very technical issue that is obviously not, that is between staff and the TAC and the consultants. It's not something that I have. I mean, I don't think you guys have the technical background either to feel comfortable with making some kind of decision that's going to could cause us a lot of problems in the future. So those are the kind of things I'm thinking out of this, because I think we're problematic, and trying to make a decision, at least today, with this first blush is very nervy, makes me nervous. I don't know
Right,
about you
and
guys.
to address it, I think it's great that everybody has differing opinions because everybody's work is better then. And so it's good that we're starting to have these birthing pains, so
Absolutely,
to speak.
absolutely.
But equally, you've hit on some implications of that, schedule implications for the MTP update. If we slow the process down, we have to think of those schedule and budgetary implications. Also, we could potentially have legal implications by not using the latest assumptions. So we could have lawsuits from the public, other agencies, FHWA, if we don't use the latest assumptions. So this decision is, of course, before the policy committee.
Do you have any further comments?
I just wanted to put it in a framework, that we can work from, so.
So
I
can I-
think, did I characterize the problem?
I
Did I
think
characterize
you
that
did,
there's
but let me-
two models now that are not in
Right.
sync?
Can I
And-
build on what you just said and ask? I'm sure that other MTPs have issues where they are adjoining populated areas which they do not control in terms of their planning regulations or any other methodology. There must be some method by which those other MTPs, or MPOs, excuse me, not MTPs, the acronyms mixed up, MPOs.
Yeah, may I be so bold as to suggest a consistency checklist and policy developed in conjunction with the state and the MPOs? Many states have a basis of data that they use, and then each MPO or county will work from that baseline data, and then they can refine it according to their socioeconomic projections and allocate that to the TAZs, and there's many other areas. And I know Jeff has worked with many MPOs, and sometimes you have issues or project-specific socioeconomic driven things that may cause different results, but that doesn't
My
mean that you
question-
can't have the
let me-
baseline info.
Let me complete my question, if you don't mind. My question was actually, there's other, and I appreciate your insight into consistent planning attacks on these issues, but I guess my bigger question is, the Mat-Su Borough obviously has, at this point, developed their own model. And I'm not sure that, they've gone through a process here in the last few years they've done that. I'm not sure how long they've had that model, if this was the first time they've really developed a solid model or not. But obviously, they are now kind of growing up in the world and becoming a little more sophisticated. At some point in the past, we decided to incorporate that area as part of our model to generate traffic numbers coming across the Kinnick Bridge, basically, is really the one data point that we care about in this whole argument, I think.
On the Glen Highway too.
The highway.
Yeah. Kinnick River Bridge. Did I say Kinnick? Yeah. God. Gotta stop drinking so early.
Anticipated this discussion. Depends on what time zone it is.
Anyway,
I like the way she quit typing right about that.
thank you. So I guess the main thing is that in the past, we have had some concern about how the traffic numbers were generated in the valley. And now what we've got is a metropolitan area which is becoming more sophisticated, and they're generating their own numbers. And so in a nutshell, what we've got now is a disagreement about their numbers that they've generated versus our model overlaying their area and numbers that we're generating, right? I mean, that's.
Right, I don't know that we have a disagreement because they haven't responded to us yet. So I'm not even sure we have a
We've
disagreement.
also got an underlying difference of how we generated those numbers, right? I mean,
Correct.
one group used ICER that was
And
5 years
time
ago.
and years.
Right, we've got dates, we've got other things. But I guess kind of leading into what Cindy said is that if they are going to be developing their own model out there at some point in time in the future, they're going to be on perhaps a totally different schedule than we are and using different underlying assumptions. This is an issue that is going to come up repeatedly, I would think, if we are going to insist on overlaying our model on top of their area every time we want to update Anchorage's traffic numbers. And I'm concerned that that is going to be a huge issue, and I mean, it already is a fairly large issue right now. I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to this thing. It bothers me somewhat that we've got staff and TAC on different sides of an issue here. That isn't really a good place for us, I think, as a policy committee to try to pick between two squabbling children. That's not something I really want to do. So I think in the spirit of good parenting, we should send you back to your, common ground to work this out between yourselves and come back with a unified recommendation would be my thought for this body. I can see that that is not sitting well with Mr. Flynn, so I will let him take a few moments.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Like I said, I spent some time researching this because I read through this in advance, and got a little,
And you still showed up?
yeah, it still showed up. I was pretty concerned about what I was reading, and you know, the splicing model to me looks like cherry picking as opposed to a defensible number. Whereas the staff recommendation does look defensible, particularly given that the labor numbers matched more or less the ICER numbers back in 2009. So we're starting from the same point, but one set's been updated and the other one hasn't. And I think the idea of moving to the Department of Labor as our basis, as apparently Fairbanks has, is a pretty good one, because we don't have to worry about whether ICER decides to do updates in the future or not. I think it is reasonable, as we move forward, to look at whatever numbers the MATSU is coming up with and seeing if that's a different input that we want to put in for that region rather than Department of Labor numbers, or use that as part of the sensitivity analysis that's discussed here. But in the interest of time and the fact that we try to get this interim MTP done, I would prefer to move the staff recommendation today and get them off dead center.
Second.
So is that a motion?
That's a motion and a second.
Motion and a second, okay. We've got a motion in front of us. Any further discussion, Mr. Steele?
I tend to agree with that, but the whole issue is that they're on a different time frame, and that the years don't match up, and that their assumptions are, that they made some time ago, don't match reality today. And so we know that theirs have some problems. And so we can't just take theirs, obviously. And so I think the staff came up with a reasonable solution. We're at some point going to have to reconcile this whole thing, because we can't go iteration after iteration down this path with those problems. But right now, we've only got one road, and the population differences are not so great that that the major highways are going to be tied up any more than they already are. And anyway, so I think it's a route to take, and I think it's a defensible route.
Okay. Ms. Howell?
I just brought up my issue, that's.
Well, we've got a motion in front of us
It's a
now.
big picture, I just want to make, it's just a
And,
big
and
picture.
may I just remind the policy committee, as a part of RFP, we are going to continue to outreach to the MATSU Bureau and continue to coordinate this and have a plan going forward in the future.
One question. Now, the staff and the tech came up with the same conclusion, right? Or did they differ?
That's exactly it.
It's different.
Yeah, the TAC was the splice thing and the
Okay.
staff was good, yeah.
Yeah, I
What-
mixed them up as to which one.
Just,
Yeah.
I did have a
I
question.
am a
Is
parent of
this-
young children, so I'm used to this stuff.
Forgot.
Just need to prepare to sell the night.
The graphs that are on here, that says draft AMATS 2040 population and the splice, but it doesn't show what the MATSU assumption is. So you don't know what that splice is. Is it just growing
No, the splice,
the 35 to 40 to 2040?
the splice is using the ICER numbers for MATSU from '09 and the Anchorage numbers from Department of Labor. That was the TAC recommendation. And I looked at that and it made my head hurt.
You want that?
I guess,
Jeff?
Gotta be defensive.
can I ask, I mean, this was written from the perspective of staff. Do we have anybody here who give the representation from the spliced side? What exactly?
And you're saying that you can't do that?
She wasn't.
I would prefer to have someone kind of make sure I got the same assumptions out of here than what I'm reading.
With a little indulgence. Jennifer, do you want to speak to the
Yes, I would, please.
position on this as opposed to the staff position?
Through the chair, and to address one of the comments from Mr. Flynn, the interim update of, as Ms. Heil was explaining, is not contingent on this model being done. That's the reason that the AMATS wanted to break that out of the technical committee, because we want to allow this to go. What I have since learned too, and it's stated in the memo from staff, is that they don't know for sure how the MATSU Bureau did their modeling. And actually, I realized just recently that they didn't have access, or they didn't realize the process, that a very, very thorough process that the Matsu Borough went through. It's actually DOT working on the Palmer, or the Parks Highway Alternative Corridor process, actually did a very, very thorough job using 2009 ICER, which was consistent with what AMATS used, informing it by the 2010 census, and also getting into very good detail about the disaggregation of the DOL numbers. And so what I have realized, and staff states in here that they don't know how they did that. I would, that was, if it did come back to the technical committee, that would have been as a TAC member, and when he's also been through the problems that Cindy referred to, is recommend that they sit down with the Matsu Borough and their consultants and understand what they did. And the reason, it sounds, the splice was the term that I came up with, but it comes down to the risk of using a much lower number in the Matsu is that we have the potential to greatly underestimate the impacts of growth in Anchorage. One thing that the Matsu model does consider, and what they are very much working on right now in their LRTP, is the impacts of the bridge. And RSG's the data that we have from them made it very clear that these growth numbers do not consider the impacts and the potential changes in population and households based on that bridge. And so I offer that as further explanation. It was, it's been frustrating, I think, for very frustrating for staff, because when they had the TAC work session with the consultant, only 2 people were able to make it. I was not one of them. And that, and in trying to move this forward in a way, but getting back to some of the initial context, based on the policy and procedures to have that coordination with the Matsu Borough. And there is, we did at the technical committee also suggested that the possibility of using, right now, of using the Matsu Borough's model and have those outputs, basically the bridge and Glen Highway, and that Anchorage use those numbers in their modeling as opposed to Anchorage doing the modeling on the Matsu side. That was discounted as being not giving us the tools to analyze the impacts of a bridge. Okay, I think I'm exhausting myself here. But it was when the risks of using 2 different sets of assumptions was brought up, I had also referred to the regs. The regs are very clear that it's for the MPO, and that the MPOs used the most recent information. It was also that in terms of defending the decision of AMATS moving forward, I can defend a splice much better than I could say using a totally different set of assumptions and say, Matsu, we think that you're going to have 25,000 people fewer in 2040 than you are planning for in 2035. I found a much more difficult position, especially looking as a DOT person on being responsible for the facilities that are going to have the greatest effect. And so that is what had happened. It came up. It's not is it the most desirable? No. I think a more desirable one is to come into agreement with how between Matsu and Anchorage, how it is going to grow. I also deferred, as a DOT member on the TAC, I would defer to the municipality of Anchorage, choosing which is appropriate for growth rates and everything within the MPO. And I would also then defer the same to the Matsu Borough. So that's where the technical, because splicing is, I just wanted to give that explanation. It came up as there is no reason why can we not accept the Matsu Borough's assumptions for itself. And especially when the greatest impact of the bridge will be coming into the Anchorage from the Matsu, potentially back and forth. And I understand also on December 8th, we're going to have a work session with the Canadian Crossing folks, and we're going to be seeing yet another set of socioeconomic assumptions and looking at another way of how to evaluate the impacts of the bridge. Shut up now.
Mr. Sullivan?
So we've talked a lot about timing here, and we don't want to slow processes down, but I think what you just mentioned about getting back together with Matsu and I guess finding out what their assumptions were, how they did their modeling, might make some sense. So how time sensitive is this really? And I guess as a secondary question, is it better to overestimate than underestimate in terms of, I mean, does it impact dollars that we receive because it's based on traffic count and population? Does it mean more money, essentially? Anybody can answer that.
Well, my gut feeling is if a region says they're going to have X amount more population, then they're going to request more funds to pay for that, so, to help with their, their transportation issues in that area, so. I mean, if you look at to me, if you look at, and again, I'm not a modeler, but if you look at a 25,000 difference in population, you have to cut out the amount of people who are not driving in terms of, we're looking at transportation impacts and how it affects our model. So that 25,000 is lowered. If you look at the difference down in just the employment, that's only about a 7,000 difference. So, and again, some of those people are working in the valley. They're not driving it. So I don't know how that would impact our model. I think that's part of what Jeff Rakanja was saying, is that if we do the sensitivity analysis, we can see whether those numbers really will make a difference. Maybe that relatively small amount won't make a difference in terms of how it impacts how we do our modeling for Dowling or Abbott or O'Malley or something like that. I don't know. I'm, again, not a modeler, but I think that was
So just to follow up, so the second half of the question though is, population certainly can make a difference, but as you mentioned, the amount of cars coming into Anchorage, does that not counterbalance the fact they may have more population, but the impact is to us because of more traffic coming into the city?
I guess it's possible, because we don't know what that split's going to be. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, it's a growth pattern issue. If they
Right.
develop in a manner that ends a more self-sufficient economy, then you have less impact to the surrounding area.
And who knows? That's why we don't know.
So, from what I understand, for the time.
This is Jeff. If I just can point out, there was a question about, what the numbers actually are. Slide 29 has the side-by-side comparison of the Matsu Borough only numbers, or excuse me, it's actually the Matsu Valley sub-area numbers. So the 2035 Matsu estimates versus the 2040 AMATS estimates are on slide 29. If people actually want to see the original raw numbers for the sub-area.
So I think if we do the interim, then we are not bound by time, and we're not in a big rush, I believe, on this.
Well, that's the theory. That's the idea.
So,
That's the
so the thing
reason.
about it is that this isn't something that we should rush on, I guess is my point. If we're gonna rush, we rush on the interim and get it done so we have more time. But the model and the process on how we're going to handle this every 4 years, to me, is something that could use a little more discussion. And I really don't think, as one of you guys pointed out, this is not unique to our area. If we got like the FHWA Regional Help Center that's set up and get their input, might be able to help on how other communities solve these kind of problems. That input might be worthwhile, and we're only a couple weeks away before we get Kabata's numbers on top of this. So to me, it's just why don't we wait till we get the whole big picture, get some extra input, and I know you don't like, they've worked really, really hard on this, but I just don't think it's ready for a decision.
So I guess that, I don't believe, Craig, you answered Mr. Sullivan's question earlier about the timeliness of this information and whether it was important in the development of either the interim or the long-term plan here that we had to make a decision this month and affect the schedule.
I think in the last page of the memo, the second to the last page, it talks about schedule implications and
Yeah, budget implications,
Yeah,
and then of
so-
course your legal implications.
it talks about additional month to prepare the spliced version and about 15,000 worth of cost to do that extra work.
Is any of that on the critical path as far as delivering either the interim or the final product?
Not on the interim, but on the final product, yes.
So you're saying if we don't take some action this month, the final product is going to fall off the edge of the schedule?
No, it's a month delay.
Just one other point. I too sat through the TAC meeting, and there was a lot of discussion on this, but one point was, well, why don't we talk with Matsu? And evidently, there have been attempts to try and get Matsu to come down and chat with us about it, but I think it'd be interesting to see what their point of view would be on that, since it's obvious that their timing on some of the growth is off. The question is, would they support one or the other?
Yeah, I guess I feel the big issue still is that we're overlaying another planning area with our numbers, and that just to me is not good practice. Whether we do it this time for expediency or not, I don't know, but in the future, it really bothers me if we're going to continually overlay our model on top of the Matsu model and claim for our purposes that our model is the true model. I think that just leads us down a path of continual friction for the foreseeable future. I would much prefer to see something where we reach some agreement internally or however we do it, that the Matsu generates their numbers and we take it again at either Kinnick Arm or Kinnick River and take those numbers and incorporate them into our model. Because as soon as we overlay our model onto them and start talking about TAS allocations and start talking about route and
We would allocate the same, distribute the allocations the same as Matsu Borough is currently doing. So that would be the same allocation.
But I just think it's a point for future friction. But I think we've chewed on this quite a while. We have a motion before us, and I believe the motion was simply to adopt the staff recommendation as per this. Is there any further discussion or comment? Any last minute, please, for sanity on this? Mr. Steele, any further comments?
Yeah, I think if it's not super time sensitive, let's give them up and ask for some reconciliation in a couple areas.
Well, that's not the motion in front of us. But
Well,
I
a
certainly
table
understand-
motion.
I understand your concern. Mr. Flynn, any further discussion? Mr. Sullivan?
I've been through these. I don't want to start adding delays in now.
Okay. Mr. Pyle, any further? I think I'm going to call for an individual vote on this because I don't think it's going to be unanimous. Mr. Steele, on the motion to adopt staff recommendations for the modeling.
No.
Mr. Flynn?
Yes.
Mr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Ms. Heil?
No.
Mr. Campbell's going to vote no also. Would anybody like to make a follow-on motion?
Move that we postpone action on either recommendation until our next meeting. And in the meantime, staff and consultants will engage the Matsu Borough and try and refine numbers,
As well as with Kinnick Arm?
as well as Kabata, yes.
Thank you.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion on that motion? Any objection to that motion passing unanimously? Seeing none. Okay.
Thank you. More business.
Thank you for your time.
Jersey range, so.
You've had your fun for the day? Okay.
You wore me out.
So our last and hopefully least controversial budget for item is the 2014 UPWP, which is the work plan, I believe.
That is correct, Mr. Chair. Again, we do a 2-year work program, but we adopt an annual budget. And so this is from the 14-15 work program, and we're asking you to adopt this 2015 budget. Nothing too spectacular to report. Obviously, the tasks are the same that are in there. We just, the TAC met and recommended approval of this particular program, as shown here.
Okay, any comments from the public on this action in front of us to adopt the UPWP? Seeing none, can I have a motion or a comment from the committee, please?
I'll move to approve.
Move to approve?
Second?
Seconded. Discussion, Mr. Flynn? None? Mr. Steele? Ms. Heil?
No.
Any objection to adoption as presented? Seeing none, that is approved. Do we have any other business that snuck in on us?
No business, sir.
Do we have any other informational items?
No informational items. I just do want to point out that there is that joint policy committee, technical advisory committee briefing on December 8th here in this room at 1:30 by Kabata and their consultants. We'll do a briefing and an opportunity for questions. It's not a work session, but it is not, it's a joint meeting, so.
Okay, so it will actually be presided over by myself. Wow.
Thanks.
That's an unpleasant Christmas present.
Hopefully you will have addressed this issue first before.
Make travel plans sooner than I thought. Committee comments, Mr. Steele,
I don't.
Mr. Flynn,
Good job.
Ms. Howell?
Yes,
Really?
yes.
Okay.
On Monday, the state released proposed regulations for PM 2.5 that mostly address Fairbanks. However, there are a couple areas that are statewide. One of those is the episode alert levels for PM 2.5. And I highly recommend the municipality of Anchorage look into that and possibly make comments. So that sets the alerts of when an action item would be publicized for PM 2.5.
Mr. Lyon, can we count on you to contact Mr. Morris on that topic?
Yes,
Probably has been contacted several times
He might
already,
be
but
in the-
one more won't hurt him.
you might be more in the loop than me.
And,
Okay.
and there is some also, no, that's probably the only one that's statewide that I just draw your attention to.
Okay, any further comments, Ms. Howell?
No, I've had enough.
Thank you. Our next technical advisory committee meeting is December 4th. This policy committee will be meeting again on December 18th. And with that, we are adjourned.